They laughed for 8 years. They laughed at the general store when she paid for the order of 200 saplings, the clerk reading the manifest from a shipping company back east. He had to ask her twice what a juggler's negro was. When she said black walnut, he looked at her over the top of his spectacles, then looked at the other men leaning on the counter, and a slow, knowing smirk spread across their faces. They laughed at the livery when she hired a wagon, not to haul feed or salt licks, but to carefully transport the crates of delicate, stick-like trees from the rail depot. They laughed over the fence posts that divided her land from theirs, watching her pace off the South Meadow, the richest pasture in the whole valley, driving stakes into the ground at intervals that made no sense for corn, or wheat, or cattle. Jedediah Stone, whose ranch bordered hers to the west, rode over the first day she broke ground. He sat high on his horse, looking down at her, a woman alone with a shovel and 100 acres. "That's good pasture you're ruining, Abigail," he said, his voice not unkind, but thick with the certainty of a man who had never been wrong about the land. "That's grass that'll finish a steer for market." She didn't look up. She just set her boot on the spade and pushed it into the deep, black soil. "It's my pasture to ruin, Jedediah." They laughed for 8 years, 3 months, and 12 days. It became a kind of calendar in the valley, a way to mark time. The laughter wasn't always loud or cruel. More often, it was a quiet, shared understanding, a shake of the head between men who knew the unforgiving calculus of ranching. It was the pitying glance from the pastor's wife, the condescending advice from the bank manager. It was the story told to newcomers to explain the strange, gridded forest rising in the valley's best grazing land, the folly of the widow Finch. They laughed because they saw a woman squandering a fine inheritance, trading cattle for twigs, trading profit for a peculiar kind of madness. They laughed until the winter of 1886. And then the snow began to fall. And for the first time in nearly a decade, no one in the valley was laughing at all. To understand the silence that followed the laughter, you have to understand the woman they were laughing at. You have to understand Abigail Finch. And to understand her, you first had to understand her husband, Bartholomew, even though he had been in the ground for a year before the first sapling ever was. Bartholomew Finch was not like the other men who had come west. He was not chasing gold, or glory, or escape. He was a quiet man from Ohio, a man who saw the land not as a thing to be conquered, but as a long and complicated equation to be solved. While other ranchers read the sky for rain, Bartholomew read almanacs and kept meticulous records in a set of leather-bound ledgers. His handwriting was a dense, precise script, documenting rainfall to the 100th of an inch, charting the first and last frost of every year, noting the subtle shifts in the wind. He had pages dedicated to the composition of the soil in each of his pastures, with samples dried and pressed between the leaves. He was a man of numbers and long patience. His neighbors measured their wealth in the number of cattle they owned, in the speed with which they could turn a calf into cash. Bartholomew measured his in decades. He saw time as the land's most valuable and misunderstood resource. Abigail had married him not for his land, but for the stillness in him, the way he could watch a hawk circle for an hour, or spend an entire afternoon observing the work of ants on a hill. He had taught her to see the world not just as it was, but as it was becoming. When the fever took him in the spring of 1877, it was swift and merciless. He left Abigail with a prosperous, well-run ranch, a herd of 300 Hereford cattle, and a profound, aching quiet in the small house they had built together. And he left her his ledgers. There were 5 of them, stored in a heavy pine crate beside his desk. For months, they remained untouched. The grief was a fog, and the daily, relentless work of the ranch was the only thing that could burn it away. She rose before dawn, mended fences, tended the herd, managed the finances, falling into bed each night too exhausted for sorrow. It was during a long, dry autumn that she finally opened the crate. The smell of old leather and paper filled the room. The first 4 ledgers were what she expected: detailed accounts, breeding records, weather data, inventories. It was the 5th ledger, the last one, that was different. It wasn't about the ranch as it was. It was about the ranch as it could be. It was titled, simply, The 75-Year Plan. In it, Bartholomew had laid out a vision that stretched far beyond his own life. He wrote of crop rotation to replenish the soil, of building stone-lined cisterns to capture rainwater against the inevitable droughts. He wrote of the cyclical nature of the cattle market, predicting booms and busts with unnerving accuracy. And then, there was the chapter that covered 20 pages. It was titled, On the Cultivation of Hardwoods for Strategic Scarcity. He argued, in his calm, logical script, that the one thing the vast plains lacked was truly valuable timber. The cottonwoods that grew along the creeks were soft and burned too fast. The pine in the distant hills was controlled by lumber consortiums. The future, he wrote, belonged not just to the man with the most cattle, but to the man who controlled the resources everyone else overlooked. He had spent 2 years researching, writing letters to botanists and foresters back east. He had concluded that one tree was superior for the soil and climate of their valley, Juglans nigra. The American black walnut. He detailed its properties with the reverence of a scholar. Its deep taproot could find water where grasses could not, making it resilient to drought. Its wood was one of the strongest and most beautiful in the world, a prize for furniture makers and gunsmiths. But that was a distant payoff, 50, 60, 70 years away. He was interested in its more immediate, practical virtues. The wood was dense, incredibly so. It burned hotter and longer than any other local wood. Its limbs, properly pruned and seasoned, would be a superior fuel source. Furthermore, a stand of mature trees, properly spaced, would act as a windbreak, a snow fence, and a shelter for livestock in the brutal winters he knew were an inevitable part of the land cycle. At the bottom of the last page, he had written a single line. They will call it folly, it read. Patience is often mistaken for madness. But the land provides for the patient man. It buries the hasty 1 inch. Reading those words, Abigail felt him in the room with her. It was not a command, but a map left for her to follow if she chose. That night, she made her decision. The South Meadow was the best pasture, yes. But its soil was also the deepest, its access to the creek the most reliable. It was the only place the trees would truly thrive. To plant the future, she would have to sacrifice the present. In the spring of 1878, she rode into town and sold 20 head of her best cattle. The price was good, the market was up. She received $450 in cash, a staggering sum. Jedediah Stone saw her at the cattle auction and tipped his hat. Expanding the herd, Abigail? A wise move. A different kind of expansion, Jedediah, she replied, and left it at that. $200 went to the bank to pay down a small loan Bartholomew had taken out. The rest went to the east. $300 for 200 dormant, bare-root black walnut saplings from a nursery in Illinois. Another $50 for freight on the railroad. The men at the bank and the rail office looked at her as if she had lost her mind. She ignored them. The execution of the plan was a testament to sheer, unyielding will. The crates arrived in late April. For 2 weeks, she worked from sunup to sundown. She used Bartholomew's detailed map from the ledger, a grid of stakes and twine that crisscrossed the 10-acre meadow. Each planting location was marked with a small red flag. The ledger was specific, holes to be dug 2 feet deep, 2 feet wide. Topsoil to be amended with river sand and composted manure. Space trees 40 feet apart to allow for mature canopy and prevent competition. This spacing is crucial. She dug every single hole herself. Her hands, already calloused from ranch work, blistered, then bled, then formed new, tougher calluses. The shovel, its wooden handle worn smooth by Bartholomew's own hands, became an extension of her body. Each evening, she would soak the saplings' roots in a barrel of water, just as the nursery's instructions dictated. Then, one by one, she planted them. She firmed the soil around each slender trunk, gave each one a bucket of water from the creek, and moved to the next. 200 times. By the time she was finished, her back screamed in protest and her arms ached with a fire that sleep could not quench. She had transformed the most productive parcel of her land into a field of sticks. The doubt period began almost immediately. The first year, the saplings were so small that from a distance, the meadow still looked empty. Jedediah Stone's comment about twigs was the opening salvo in a long campaign of communal skepticism. That summer was dry, and she spent countless hours hauling water from the creek, giving each fragile tree the moisture it needed to survive. Her other pastures suffered, the grass turning brown and brittle. She had to buy supplemental hay for her herd, an expense she could have avoided if the south meadow were still in use. Mr. Harding, the owner of the general store, made a point of mentioning it when she came in to settle her account. Tough year to be watering trees, Abigail. That hay bill must sting. A necessary cost, she said, her voice even. By the third year, the trees were head-high, a dense thicket of green leaves in the summer. But they produce nothing. No nuts, no forage, no shade to speak of. They were simply there. A monument to her stubbornness. The laughter had solidified into a kind of local axiom. A harebrained scheme was Abigail's folly to stubborn refusal to admit a mistake was pulling a finch. She heard the whispers. She saw the looks. But she also saw the trees. She saw the way their bark was beginning to furrow, the way their branches were thickening. She continued the work, following Bartholomew's ledger as if it were scripture. Each winter, she pruned the lowest branches, a task he called culling for strength. The wood was still green, but she stacked it neatly in a long, high rick behind the barn, letting it season in the dry prairie air. The pile grew with each passing year. The 5th year brought a severe drought. The creek on her property slowed to a trickle. The prairie grass cured on the stem, turning vast swaths of the valley a dusty, desperate yellow. Cattle grew thin. Ranchers were forced to sell off their stock at rock-bottom prices, flooding the market and driving it into the ground. Her neighbors, their faces grim and sun-cracked, told her she'd made a fatal error. If you had that south meadow, one of them told her, his voice devoid of its usual mockery and full of genuine, if misplaced, pity, you could have held on to another 50 head. You'd be weathering this just fine. That year was the hardest. She sold off more cattle just to buy feed for the rest. She sold her chickens' eggs in town and the jars of vegetables she'd put up from her garden. She lived on beans and bread. But she never considered cutting down a single tree. Their deep taproots, just as Bartholomew had predicted, were finding water where the grasses could not. While the rest of the valley baked, her grove remained a patch of defiant green. She saw it as a sign. By the 8th year, the trees were well established, some reaching heights of 25 feet. Their canopies were beginning to spread, casting real shade. The laughter had mostly faded, replaced by a permanent state of quiet disapproval. She was no longer a subject of active mockery, but a permanent feature of the local landscape, like a strange rock formation or a dried-up riverbed. The widow with her forest. Her folly was complete, and as far as anyone could see, it had yielded nothing. The market value of that 10 acres of prime pastureland had been traded for a woodlot that would not produce marketable timber for another 50 years. It was, by any rational measure, a catastrophic economic failure. This is a story about patience. It's a story about seeing what others can't. If you believe in the power of a long-term plan, and you want to see more stories like this one, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. It helps us keep these histories alive. Now, let me tell you about the winter of 1886. It began on the 3rd day of January, 1887. The morning was deceptively mild, with a strange, heavy stillness in the air. The sky was the color of slate. Abigail, checking on her herd, felt a change in pressure, a deep hum in the earth that she had learned to recognize. Bartholomew had written about it in his ledgers, beware the calm before the white fury. The prairie holds its breath before it screams. She spent the rest of the day securing the shutters on her house, double-checking the latches on the barn, and moving her remaining 80 head of cattle into the most sheltered part of the ranch, the northern edge of the Black Walnut Grove. The trees, now thick and tall, formed a formidable wall against the prevailing north wind. The first flakes began to fall in the late afternoon. They were not the gentle, drifting flakes of a normal snowfall. They were small, hard, and driven by a rising wind. By sunset, the wind was a gale, and the snow was a horizontal blizzard. The world outside her windows disappeared into a churning, roaring vortex of white. The sound was terrifying, a constant, high-pitched scream that seemed to tear at the very foundations of the house. For 3 days and 3 nights, it did not stop. The temperature plummeted. First to 0, then to 10 below, then 20. The old-timers would later say it hit 40 below 0, a cold so profound it felt like a physical blow, a cold that could freeze a man's lungs in a matter of minutes. Inside her small, sturdy house, Abigail was safe. She had her stores of food, and she had her fuel. The fireplace was stoked with the seasoned black walnut limbs she had been accumulating for 8 years. Just as Bartholomew's ledger had promised, the wood burned with an intense, steady heat, creating a core of warmth that the wind could not penetrate. The dense logs glowed for hours, leaving behind long-lasting coals. When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, the world was remade. The sun rose on a landscape of impossible, sculptural beauty and utter devastation. The snow was piled in drifts 15 feet high, burying fences and outbuildings. The valley was silent, the screaming wind replaced by an absolute, muffled stillness. The temperature remained dangerously low. The true cost of the blizzard became apparent over the next week. The town, isolated and cut off from the railway, quickly exhausted its fuel supply. The coal yard was empty. The wood sold at the general store, soft cottonwood, was gone in 2 days. People began burning fence posts, then furniture. A desperate chill settled over the community. But the greatest tragedy was on the ranch's cattle, caught in the open, had frozen to death where they stood, grim statues of hide and bone. Herds were decimated. Some ranchers lost everything. The first visitor to the Finch Ranch was Jedediah Stone. He appeared 10 days after the storm, his face gaunt and gray, his horse struggling through the deep snow. He didn't ride up with his usual confidence. He stopped at the edge of the grove, looking not at Abigail, but at the thin curl of smoke rising from her chimney, a sight that must have seemed like a miracle. He dismounted and walked toward her, his head bowed against the cold. "Abigail," he began, his voice raspy. He couldn't meet her eyes. "My wife, the children. We're out of wood. We've been burning the chairs from the kitchen." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a shame that was more painful than any pride. "Can I buy some wood from you? I'll pay whatever you ask." Abigail looked at the man who had mocked her for nearly a decade. She saw no triumph in his desperation, only a shared humanity in the face of a brutal world. She motioned for him to follow her into the house. She poured him a cup of hot coffee, and while he drank it, his hands shaking, she retrieved Bartholomew's 5th ledger. She opened it to the chapter on forestry management. "He knew a storm like this would come one day," she said quietly, pointing to a passage. "He wrote that a community's strength isn't in its richest man, but in its deepest reserves." She then led him out to the massive, neatly stacked woodpile behind the barn. It was more than 8 feet high and 30 feet long, a fortress of seasoned hardwood. "I don't want your money, Jedediah," she said, handing him an axe. "I want your help hauling a load to the church for the pastor's family. Then we'll load your wagon." Jedediah stared at the woodpile, then at her, and for the first time, the full scope of her 8 years of labor became clear to him. It wasn't folly. It was foresight. It was salvation, stacked and waiting. He simply nodded, unable to speak. Word spread quickly. Sheriff Brody, a practical man who had once advised Abigail to cut her losses and plow the meadow under, organized a town meeting in the half-frozen church. The situation was dire. The railroad was still blocked by immense drifts. Families were getting sick from the cold. He stood before the small gathering and publicly acknowledged his error. "We have been short-sighted," he announced, his voice echoing in the cold air. "We have one resource that can get us through this. And it is thanks to the prudence of a neighbor we have all." Misunderstood, he looked directly at Abigail. "Mrs. Finch, the town is in your debt. We need your help." Abigail, with Bartholomew's ledger as her guide, organized the effort. She showed the men which trees to harvest from, directing them to take only the largest of the lower branches to ensure the long-term health of the grove. The grid-like planting, once a source of ridicule, now proved to be a stroke of genius. The wide spacing had prevented the snow from drifting into impassable walls, allowing men and wagons to move through the trees and work efficiently. The Black Walnut Grove, Abigail's Folly, became the town's lifeline. For 2 weeks, a steady train of wagons made its way to her ranch, hauling away the dense, life-saving wood. Mr. Harding, the store owner, was one of the last to come. His wife had taken ill with pneumonia, and the doctor said the only thing that could help was to keep her in a constantly warm room. He approached Abigail at the edge of the grove, his face a mask of worry, his usual arrogance stripped away by fear. He offered her triple the going rate for a full cord of her best wood. Abigail listened patiently. Then she went to her root cellar and returned not only with instructions for his hired man on where to load the wood, but with 3 jars of her own chicken broth and one of her precious tins of tea. "This will do her more good than your money," she said, pressing them into his hands. Harding looked at the jars, then at her face, illuminated by the cold winter light. "We were fools, Abigail," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "All of us. We were fools." When the great blizzard of '87 finally broke and the spring thaw arrived, it revealed a changed world. The valley was scarred. The cattle herds were shattered, with losses estimated at over 60%. Several families, their livelihoods wiped out, packed up and moved on. But the town of Prairie Ridge had survived. And the Finch Ranch had not only survived, it had prevailed. Abigail's cattle, sheltered by the dense grove, had weathered the storm with minimal losses. The ranch was intact. The grove was no longer called Abigail's Folly. The townspeople now referred to it, with a mixture of awe and gratitude, as Finch would. Abigail never once said, "I told you so." She never had to. The proof was in the warmth of their homes, in the survival of their children. The quiet vindication was more powerful than any words. That summer, her nephew Nathan arrived. His family's farm in Kansas had been ruined by the same storm system, and at 20 years old, he came west looking for a new start. He was a strong, quiet young man, with his Uncle Bartholomew's thoughtful eyes. Abigail took him in, and he became the son she never had. She began to teach him, not just the work of a ranch, but the philosophy behind it. She brought out the pine crate and showed him the 5 ledgers. Together, they would sit at the kitchen table in the evenings, the lamplight falling on Bartholomew's elegant script. She showed him the 75-year plan. She explained the science of the deep taproots, the strategy of pruning, the long-term economics of the timber. She passed on the wisdom that had been left to her. He listened, his gaze shifting from the pages of the ledger to the window, where the black walnut tree stood as dark, strong silhouette against the setting sun. He was looking at a legacy. The laughter had faded into the past, a distant echo from a more ignorant time. They had laughed at a woman planting trees. They saw a fool digging holes in a perfectly good pasture, trading today's profit for tomorrow's uncertainty. What they couldn't see, what they didn't have the vision to comprehend, was the truth of her work. She wasn't just planting saplings. She was planting time itself. She was planting patience in a world that demanded instant results. She was planting a future in a land that was notoriously unforgiving of those who only thought of the present. Some people look at a seed and see only what it is, a small, insignificant thing. A rare few, however, look at that same seed and see the cathedral of branches it will become. They see the shade it will offer on a hot day a generation from now. They see the fire it will provide in a blizzard no one has yet predicted. They see the long, deep shadow the forest will cast 100 years into the future.